Hey everyone! In case you're new here, I'm Christina, and I'm a graduate student in journalism and communication, and this is Media Tidbits. Okay, so for today's video, I want to talk about key messages and the role they play in the media. It was super clear to me after watching a body language expert deem Johnny Depp's lawyers as winging it in a television interview that a good chunk of people have no idea what key messages are. And spoiler, they weren't winging it. And that's why today we're going to talk about what key messages are and how to spot them quickly, the details, the when, why, and how we use key messages, and the importance of framing in an interviewee's response. All right, so key messages are exactly what they sound like. They are primary points that must be communicated to target audiences. They are clear, succinct main statements about the organization, event, situation, or issue. These core messages educate, advocate, brand, enforce, promote, or explain aspects of a campaign. And that definition was taken directly from Fundamentals of Public Relations of Marketing and Communications in Canada. So in absolutely plain English, key messages are the interviewee's main messages, or, as they're commonly known, talking points. And guess what? We don't just see these being used by Johnny Depp's or Amber Heard's lawyers. We actually see them at every press conference and political presser ever. Every single one. So remember key messages the next time you see either a press conference or a political presser on TV, because that's what they're doing. So basically, before an interview, the interviewee or their communications team, and you best believe Amber Heard and Johnny Depp have communications teams, as do their lawyers. So the interviewee and or their communications team will write down all the details surrounding a situation, and they'll often ask why or how questions to get to the core of their messaging. And then they're going to put those responses into short, concise, and clear statements. Usually 3 or 4 of them because they're easier to remember, but it's not always 3 or 4, it could be more. And that's what they are putting out there when they're in these interviews. And to spot them, and spot them quickly, listen for key phrases. Listen for ideas and phrases that are repeated.
Amber had an enormous amount of evidence, although a lot of it was suppressed in this case as opposed to the UK. We had an enormous amount of evidence that was suppressed in this case that was in the UK case. There's a tremendous amount of evidence, much of which did not come into this trial, did come into the UK trial. There was so much evidence that did not come in. They were able to suppress the medical records, which were very, very significant because they showed a pattern back. We even had more evidence. We had medical records. We had mental health records that went back to 2012 that were contemporaneous, going all the way back to 2012 of Amber reporting this to her therapist, for example. We had significant amount of texts, including from Mr. Depp's assistants. We had text messages from Mr. Depp's assistant.
And the verdict speaks for itself. The verdict speaks for itself. The facts are what they were. The jury made a unanimous decision based on those facts. And it was unanimous.
The evidence was listened to carefully on both sides. This was a decision made by the jury on the evidence presented by both sides. And as Camille said, it was overwhelmingly in Mr. Depp's favor. Again, it came overwhelmingly in Johnny's favor. The verdict was overwhelmingly in his favor.
The verdict is overwhelmingly positive for Johnny. The facts in this case were overwhelmingly positive for Johnny.
And you're telling me they're winging it? Yeah, right. So how should these key messages be used then? Should the interviewee just spit them out every time a journalist poses a question? Yes, but no. The interviewee has to actually be super careful and put on a bit of a balancing act, because on the one hand, repetition is good because it helps the audience understand and accept the message. But on the other hand, repetition is bad because if the audience feels overexposed to the same wording or talking points, so they keep hearing the same things over and over and over again, they're not going to believe a word. So like when a person doesn't answer the journalist's question and goes back to repeating those talking points, this can make the audience believe that the interviewee is lying because we're not addressing the question. And it doesn't mean that they are lying. It just, it could be that the interviewee is super nervous, or maybe the interviewee hasn't had a lot of media training and not enough practice, or maybe it's just none of those things and they resort back to their talking points because they're just not good at performing in that kind of situation. But the problem is, once you've lost the audience, the delivery of the key messages has failed. So when asked a question, really it's best practice to address that question. So acknowledge it in some way and then answer it in some way, and then transition to one of your key messages. One thing that's important, especially in the Depp Heard scenario, when two parties or teams are like pitted against one another, is how the teams frame their answers. And I'm not going to get too deep into this one because there is a lot. It'll come back in more detail later, but I'll give you the basic rundown for now. Let's veer away completely from Johnny Depp and Amber Heard for a second and recall one of the most popular terms public health used during the COVID-19 pandemic. Social distancing. Remember that one? How could we forget? Well, now how would you feel if public health told you, instead of social distancing, they just told you needed to stay away from people? That's it. That's the phrasing. That's the messaging. Stay away from people. What if public health used that instead of social distancing? Well, stay away from people evokes fear. Fear of people, fear of public spaces, and so on. So it's framing things in a negative way. But when public health used social distancing, well, look, it has a fuzzier ring, doesn't it? Because after all, the word social is in it, which implies that we can indeed socialize as long as we stay at a reasonable distance. Now take the example now of a survivor of domestic violence. And notice how I said survivor and not victim. So what comes to mind when I say survivor? Besides the TV show, obviously. But we think of someone strong who can get through anything, right? Right. Now, how about victim? Well, we think of someone helpless and someone who went through a very unfortunate situation. And that's the importance of framing in a nutshell. So where do you see key messages and where do you see evidence of framing? Drop me a comment. Let's talk about it.